So, to get started on what we're discussing today, we are talking about the function of the first act. Now, for the people who weren't around last week, we covered the second act, and we're talking about its function and how it's not as evil or scary as we like to pretend it is. Also, since I didn't quite realize this until last week, the second act comprises about half the book in word count. So, the first act, ipso facto, is about a quarter, and the last act is about a quarter-ish. These are not hard set rules. It's just more just to give the people who need the visualization, the imagery. So if you're working on a 60,000 word book, the first 15,000 are going to be about the first act, more or less. And as I'm writing the current book I'm working on, I have found that to be 100% true. I'm not sure how many words this book is going to be, but at about the 15,000 word mark, I was like, and kaboom, Act 2. So it sort of worked for me, but don't overthink it, and don't be like, I must have it be at this exact word count or else everything's going to fail. Don't do that, because you will torture yourself. And that's my job. Let me torture you. Don't you torture you. Act 2 did it much like Firefly. It likes to hang around and say boo. So bonus points for anybody who gets that reference. So we talked about the function of Act 2 last week and how it is where the action kind of peaks and you torture your main characters. So, right, exactly, Anagram. It's kind of scary. It just sort of works that way. In the first act, you have a number of things you have to get done. Your job in the first act is to introduce your main character, introduce your setting, and introduce the main conflict. Even if the main conflict isn't what the characters and the reader think it is at the beginning, that's the goal of the first act, those three things. Now, for those of you who are using the beat sheet, which, I will never stop singing about, so live with it. In the first act, you have the opening image, the theme stated, the setup, the catalyst, and the debate. Those 5 pieces end up in the first act according to the beat sheet here. And through those 5 phases, excuse me, goodness, you introduce the 3 things I mentioned: the character, the setting, and the conflict. Now, over the course of those 15-ish thousand, again, I'm assuming a 60,000 word book for the purposes of the math here. Over the course of that first 15,000 words or so, you're going to be introducing all of these things. Which means you don't need to info dump, and you don't need to introduce all of it at once. It doesn't need to be like, oh, by the way, here's literally everything I know about the world and its people in chapter 1. Which is, 10,000 words. Thank you for playing. And your reader's going to look at that for half a second, turn white, put your book down, walk away, and they're never coming back. You'll never see them again. So don't give in to the temptation to lean too heavy on the exposition all at once. Now, we can talk about each of these things separately. I'm going to start with introducing your main character or characters. And I'm going to use the novel that I'm working on right now as an example, so spoiler alert. I'm sorry if anybody hasn't read it yet and was wanting to. No. So, spoiler alert on that. If you haven't read up to where we are right now, I'd tell you to cover your ears, but, yes, the Angels one, Ellie, the one that I'm currently up to my ears in. So, in the first chapter, I introduce my main character, Cass. I introduce her by having her fall out of the sky and end up in a crater created by her own, gravity. That introduction is about the only introduction you get. You don't learn much more about her until the very end of Act 1, except for the fact that she knows nothing about the world and finds it excessively confusing. Which is part of the theme of the book, is her coming to terms with what the world is like and her place in it. Um, so that is both the opening image and the introduction of the main character. Then, in addition to that, you have the introduction of Father John, who is one of the more important side characters in that part of the book. He is her coach. He teaches her about how the world works. He shows her all of the various, he teaches her, like, okay, so this is how you put on pants, kind of thing. Because Cass has no idea. And through this character, who is in function of a number of literary terms, Cassiel is the idiot character to which everybody needs to explain everything. Which, given that I am working with a somewhat complicated urban fantasy setting, you are going to be needing that explanation because the reader doesn't know anything either, except for the fact that, yes, there are cars, there are cell phones, I don't need to explain to you how those work. So using people explaining things to her, I'm able to explain the setting. And I only have her need explanation on certain things that the reader would need explanation on. For example, in my setting, the tusked races, so orcs, ogres, and trolls, have major race situations with the elves and with the sapiens. Sapiens in this setting are what I call the humans, because all of those races are human, and then the metas are individuals with magic. That's how I'm categorizing it. Don't think about it too hard. Featherless biped, behold a man. We're just gonna blow right past that because I'll explain it better later. And right now I'm just writing the first draft. So Diogenes is my man. So I'm having them explain that race element to her and how there's this conflict going on because Cass would have no idea. She's an angel. She was from the moon. She just hung out there. So the race interaction makes no sense to her. That actually happens in Act 2, but it does happen relatively early on. She meets some elves and some other things that suggest, okay, there's magic in this world. Okay, there's magical creatures in this setting. I mention a couple. I mention a satyr. I mention a couple of elves. I mention a tusked. I mention a sapien. I mention there's creatures. But rather than just info dumping, like, okay, so the tusked races don't get along with the elves and the humans because during World War II, the Nazis were actually persecuting them along with a whole bunch of other things and yada, yada, yada. So rather than info dumping the entire backstory of the world that my husband and I have come up with, which is really neat, by the way, and will come into play later, I kind of put little pieces in it, and the reason I'm not giving it all at once is A, I don't want to write the Silmarillion. This is a novel, not a history book, which the Silmarillion is a history book, not a novel. It's just the history of Middle Earth. I have not read it. I don't intend to read it. But I don't think there's a first L. The Silmarillion was written by J.R.R. Tolkien as a companion piece to Lord of the Rings that tells about the history of Middle Earth and gives a lot of the deeper lore. It's more or less a history book about a fantasy world. It is exceptionally dry. It is not written like a novel. Yes, front loading is a great term. I love it. So anybody who doesn't know Tolkien, the Silmarillion is that. So then we have, hey, you're entirely correct, Ellie, that is exactly what it is. It's basically taking the appendices of your story and making it the book. But that's okay. That's what he was trying to write. That's what he was going for. He wasn't going for an exciting fantasy story like he was with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. He was literally writing a history. So the Silmarillion's great for the people who are into that thing. And it was written with that intent and to that audience. It's fine. I don't have a problem with it. We're good. But don't turn your fantasy novel into the Silmarillion by mistake by front-loading everything. It is going to go badly for everyone, and you will lose all your readers and be sad. Conversely, if you are working on a fantasy setting and don't tell your readers anything, they are going to be extremely lost. You know, if they don't have any idea of what race is, or even what technology level, or magic, or no magic, or any of these things that are in your setting, if they know nothing about it, they're going to have trouble following your plot, because if your characters know the world they're in, and your reader doesn't, and the characters have nobody to explain anything to, and the writer as the narrator doesn't explain it, you're going to have a bad time. It's not going to be fun, and it's going to be confusing, and I have run into this myself, because more than once, I have just written a book, and I know the setting, I know the characters, I know the world, I know everything about the world, but I never tell the readers anything about the world, and so they're like, okay, I guess this stuff is happening, I don't really understand why, but here we are, I suppose. So that is, it's a thing, and it can be fixed in editing, so if you run into this where you realize that, oh crap, I just wrote my story and explained absolutely nothing, it's pretty easy to go back in and add little chunks, like a paragraph or two of exposition in places as needed. So if you've done this and I have just made you make that face, this one right here, if I made you make that face, it's okay. We'll get through it, and you can go back and fix it later. So don't go back into your novel and start like furiously pounding at the keys and trying to get everything to line up. It's fine. As is our mantra, write first, then edit. Don't edit while writing. Don't do it. So, you've introduced your main character. You're talking about the setting in so much as you're helping them understand what's different from outside my window right now. Since I'm doing urban fantasy, I have what's outside my window right now, plus more. In sci-fi, right, Ellie, you absolutely need some telling in certain genres. So in the genres that I'm talking about, sci-fi and fantasy and all of its various and sundry subgenres are the biggest, the ones who need the most explanation, because usually we're not working in the world as we know it. We're not working in what I know reality to be, and if I'm changing reality, I need to explain it. So they have the toughest world building hurdles to clear, because you need to simultaneously explain everything about the world while not doing it all at once too much in a way that's going to make your reader's head spin. So it's going to it's tough. Yes, hit them over the head with all of those made up words in 3 languages and provide a glossary in the back with pronunciations, and make sure all of those words are at least 3 syllables long and contain an apostrophe and an accent aigu. Do that. Recipe for success. Don't listen to me. So in those, but if you're going to be taking the world as it is outside, you don't really need to do a ton of world building. Like if, in most sitcoms, we'll go with a sitcom. In a sitcom, like Seinfeld, well, the world was as it was in, I think, the 90s. Seinfeld was the 90s, right? Yeah. So the world was what the world was in the 90s, no world building needed. Everybody knew what it was like outside in the 90s. So if you are going to be using, oh no, Raichu, no bad. If you're going to be doing all of that, hold on a second, I've got a phone call, I guess.
Okay, that's fine. All right, thank you. You too, bye-bye.
Sorry about that. Important phone call. So, right, well, 2020, I've forgotten what the world outside is like, which is why I write fantasy, because it's all in my head, just like the world is. Anyway, 2020. So, the, apostrophe, oh no, I'm not even going to try pronouncing that out loud. You can just pronounce that out loud yourself. So if you've got a setting where things are pretty much the same as the world is outside. Like, say you're writing a spy novel, and you might need to explain some tradecraft stuff. For those of you who don't know, tradecraft is what the spy folks call their work. So it would be infiltration, how to convince people of things using assets. Assets can also include people. So if you need to explain tradecraft, think of it. I don't know how many of you have watched Burn Notice, but Michael Weston in a lot of the episodes explains this is how you do this thing in tradecraft with some degree of accuracy and, of course, leaving out important parts so that the show doesn't get black bagged. So you have things like that. So you can explain those things as they come up, but you don't have as much setting to build. The Dresden Files takes place in Chicago. I have never been to Chicago, but I've been to cities. You know, I've been to Boston, I've been to New York, I've been to Detroit. So a city's a city. But he doesn't need to do a lot of world building with Chicago, though he does mention landmarks like the museum where Sue happens, and the aquarium, and a large number of, places that people who live in Chicago would be like, ah, yes, I know this, this is good. And people who've never been to Chicago will be like, okay, this exists, I guess. But he doesn't go in depth into explaining all of those things and describing them in intimate, excessive detail. The place where he starts really describing stuff is when he starts talking about the magic and how magic works and the creatures that are out there. He talks about the White Council and the Outsiders and all these other things. I'm on a Dresden kick because the new book just came out and I'm trying to read the series to start the new book. So you get Dresden metaphors. So you have those, that's what he concentrates his explanations on. And this is an all the book thing, not just the first part of the book, but when you're dealing with sci-fi fantasy, there's a lot of it in the beginning, so I'm kind of having to cover both. So with the setting introduced, you now introduce the conflict. The introduction of the conflict, if we're looking at the beat sheet, usually comes with the catalyst, so that'll be towards the end of your first act, is going to be where this conflict really comes out and shows up. In my novel, In Fallen, the one I'm working on that you've been seeing me update every so often, it is when, spoiler alert, cover your ears if you don't want to hear, when Father John dies. Thank you, dear. That is, in fact, the catalyst that sets up the main character's introduction to what's going on and why they need to engage with it. Because while I could make a novel of a fallen angel just trying to understand how to put on pants in the morning, it wouldn't be very exciting for people to read. And if you don't have that conflict, you don't have a story. There is no such thing as a story without conflict, even if that conflict is man versus nature. So the conflict is Into Thin Air, I think was the name of the book, where it was about, right, where are my pants? No, there's conflict in Where Are My Pants because he doesn't know where his pants are. That's the conflict. It's a dumb conflict, but it's there. Into Thin Air, it's man versus nature. So you have the individual who is stuck in a remote area trying to survive. So it's the conflict is between the main character and the elements, or the main character and bears, or whatever happens to show up. Or I think he ends up dying of a disease of some kind, if I remember properly. It's been a long time since I read the book. I read it in high school. But the conflict isn't always with a person or with an antagonist that we might recognize as, oh, there's the Palpatine. It might be conflict of a number of different varieties. The conflict could even be internal. So the character is wrestling with something in themselves that is the main conflict of the book. It might not be my jam, but it definitely could be done. So this conflict comes into the forefront in the catalyst, which, as to use an example that most people will know, and if you don't know it, well, you are a sad, sorry little man, and you have my pity. I'm the moment when Owen and Beru get killed in Star Wars, when Luke walks up and sees his aunt and uncle, the people who raised him, as charred skeletons on the ground. That is the catalyst. At that moment, he realizes that the entire world before is done. There's no going back to it. He can't just stay there and be a moisture farmer on Tatooine. It's not going to work for him. Hi, Carl. I don't mind at all. Welcome. Um, so you have him engaging with that and dealing with the fact that, oh, everything has just gone pear-shaped and I need to deal with this. So at this point, you take the rug that's underneath the main character's feet and you give it a sharp little tug. Now, you don't pull it all the way out from under them and send them backflipping into oblivion until Act 2, after the midpoint, to go back into last week's, after the midpoint, Act 2 is when you have that backflipping into oblivion moment. But at this point, you give the rug that's under the main character's feet a firm little, like, eh. Like, so they are unbalanced, and they have to choose to respond to this or are forced to respond to this because otherwise they will fall over. And if the character doesn't rise to the conflict, then you don't have a story. Whether they choose to rise or they are forced to rise because I said so, damn it, I'm in charge, that's fine. But that decision to engage with the story happens in Act 1, and that is where the conflict is introduced. And then following that, you have the debate where the character kind of has to decide for themselves that they are going to engage with this conflict, whether they're forced to or not. The internal moment of, I have to handle this. So in the novel I'm writing, Cass has that discussion with Jim about, well, the mortal police can't handle what's going on. They aren't going to be able to deal with what's at the end of this, what's causing this. They aren't going to know how to find it. I don't know how to find it or what to do about it, but I know I can fight it if I have to. And of everybody here, I'm the only person qualified. So, so Kat, your question there regarding fear versus want, it doesn't have to be fear, but fear is one of the most universal human experiences. So fear, it might not be like afraid for their life, but they might be like, I'm kind of interested in this new relationship. Maybe it'll work out, but I'm worried that it won't, and there's something holding me back from it. The debate section of the beat sheet, which is the very end of Act 1, is almost always about fear. So you have Luke afraid to leave Tatooine because it's all he's ever known. Afraid because the Empire is apparently coming after him. Afraid because he doesn't know if Ben Kenobi knows anything, and he's a freaky old religious man who lives in the desert. So there's a lot happening in all of that. So fear is a big part of it, but it doesn't have to be the driving factor. It doesn't have to be the only driving factor. You could go with anger. The character. So in one of the books Insomnia has published, that we have since let go. I think it was Red Fist of Rome. Anyway, the main character's wife gets killed, and he engages with the main story and decides to uproot his whole life and move to Rome because his wife died, because he wants to take revenge on the person who killed her. It's not so much fear, but it is a driving emotion that makes the main character leap into action. Now, the emotion that your character is experiencing is probably not going to be happy. You're correct, Ellie. Very few people go F yeah when it comes to changes coming, but part of that is because most of the time the catalyst is something scary. It's something, typically, whether it's bad or not, empirically speaking, it's typically scary, and it puts the main character on their heels a little bit. That's the whole point. It takes that security, that stability, even if it's not happy, healthy stability or happy, healthy security, but it's what somebody knows, and the darkness stirs. It takes that security and kind of frays it apart. You know, it's where you start poking holes in the Afghan of your main character's story and pulling on the threads to start just like unraveling their little world in front of them. And it is the beginning of the end, mustache twirling, yes, tie them to the train tracks. So you have this moment where everything that they thought they knew, everything that they we're comfortable with is changing. It's not bad, but it's certainly a change. Um, I know that I'm not super excited about the franchise, but it's one everybody knows. So in Harry Potter, you've got that moment where uh, Hagrid shows up and says, "By the way, you're a wizard, and you aren't in fact just a little kid nobody wants, foisted off to live with his aunt and uncle. You are in fact somebody important. You have value, and I'm gonna take you into this magical world where you can explore this, where you can learn about it and grow." In fact, he's a little bit nervous about it, but he's also excited because it means that, oh, I actually do matter somewhere. I actually am important somehow. So you can go that route with that thing, but it's some kind of drive, and that's an example of Harry didn't really have a choice. Hagrid was taking him to Diagon Alley to get his stuff, and he was going to Hogwarts one way or another. He didn't really have a say in the matter, it just sort of happened. So there's an example of a catalyst where the main character didn't exactly choose the thing that happened, but it does happen, regardless. So you have that sort of thing, and that is a perfectly valid way of getting a character into the main story. I'm kind of the opinion that a lot of the videos, a lot of the blogs out there that say there's only one way to accomplish this thing are full of bullshit. There are a lot of ways to accomplish the same ends. There are a lot of ways to get your character to do a thing. There are a lot of ways to accomplish just about anything. Unless you're talking like typesetting and kerning and leading and all that other stuff, like the really nitty-gritty things. But most of the time, there's not one true way to do things in writing. Now, Heather, there are absolutely better ways and worse ways, and there are a lot of different ways there are a lot of different paths you can take to get to the same end. So I'm not saying that it's all loosey-goosey, there's no right, no wrong. I'm just saying there's not one specific formula that works for everybody. And trying to force everybody into the same box is a really bad idea, particularly when you're talking about creatives. Because then you'll get people who end up turning into rules lawyers types. Anybody who plays D&D will get what I'm talking about. People who are more interested in the rules and adhering to the rules than they are in the creativity and the fun surrounding it. So there are guys, it's Pirates of the Caribbean. They're more like guidelines than actual rules, but they are there. They are valid. So, like for example, the don't info dump on your reader ever, pretty much, that's a pretty hard and fast rule. You should not just. So, to use an example of this info dumping that I hate, I tried to read Martin's books, Song of Ice and Fire. I tried reading the Game of Thrones. I tried it. And as I've complained about before, he spent a lot of time in the early pages talking about the specific construction and details about this one dude's cloak. There was no story. There was no plot. There was no setting. There was only cloak. And yeah, it was about a cloak for at least a page and a half, I think, if I remember properly. And it was important to the story because it was metaphor and characterization about I don't know, but frankly, it was, yeah, everything was cloak. I was not, Tale of Ice and Cloak, there we go, perfect, can it, we're done. I couldn't, there was nothing for me to grab onto, there was just, okay, clothes, great. Now, I like clothes, I like metaphor, I like description, I like using a character's appearance to hint at their characterization. There's a whole lot of great ways you can do that, but I don't want a page and a half or more of the details of the construction of a garment on a dude I haven't met yet and a story I have no fucks about whatsoever. So it's a really bad idea to just lean into that. That's what I mean about, like, that's a hard and fast rule. Don't do it. Don't do that. Don't do that. Yes, there are books that are very successful that do it, Song of Ice and Fire. But it's successful to a very small. I see. It was really widely loved, but I think the people who really enjoy that kind of writing is a rather small subsect of the fantasy genre. They're also the same people who really get into Tolkien. And I respect it. I'm not talking down about it. But if you want something that's more widely acceptable and widely accessible, and people aren't going to just skip huge chunks of your story, you don't need to start with A Song of Ice and Cloak. You're going to want to utilize other things. And so, hard and fast rule, don't info dump. It's bad. Right, like I don't like that type of I don't like purple prose because I find it demeaning to me because it tells me that the author doesn't think I'm capable of picturing anything in my head. Two, it ruins my ability to picture things in my head because it gives me too much information and then I see nothing except words. To answer your question about what purple prose is bloated. It is too much description in one place. It's when somebody describes, like the cloak situation, where someone described every fiber in this cloak and the exact construction, when it doesn't, in fact, effing matter to the book. So there are moments where you might need that much in-depth, precise description of something. Those moments are very important, and they are valuable. And they should be used. Now, this is employing a technique called Chekhovs Gun. A lot of you might know it, some people might not. So Chekhovs Gun comes from playwriting, where this individual, Anton Chekhov, said basically, if you put a gun on the wall in the first act, it had better come back and be used by Act 3, or else you've wasted my time with the props. Exactly, Kat, exactly. So you want to have the thing that you put that much description and attention into, it had better be important. And if it isn't important and you've wasted my time, I'm not going to be super excited about it. And worse, if you have taken to describing everything like that, I'm not going to know what's important and what isn't. And there's a good chance that since I will be skipping those passages, I am going to be missing important details of your plot and not understand what's coming up. I'm going to be just like, oh, okay, I guess that random glyph on a wall where you described the fresco for 4 pages but didn't really highlight the glyph is important. I guess that mattered and I was supposed to remember it. Oh, foreshadowing? What? I guess. Whereas if you've got a writer who doesn't describe things to that detail but spends time to be like, on the wall was a glyph and they describe the glyph and they don't really describe a ton of other things, that's going to stick in the mind. And when that glyph comes back to being important later, the reader's going to be like, aha! And they'll be able to put it together. Readers are smart people. They're capable of putting those things together. And if you have a reader who isn't capable of putting that together, well, you've just pulled one over on them. They're going to be super, super surprised and probably really happy. And yeah, Ellie, that's a really good way of describing it. Using details as the way musicians use dynamics in songwriting is exactly correct. You want to have things grow to a crescendo or drop down to a decrescendo at different points, and usually when something is a crescendo, think movie scores, something important is happening when the music gets really loud and powerful. That's a really good way of explaining it, Ellie. I like it. And as a musician, that's a thing, for me. So yes, also because dynamics are kind of like musical punctuation in a way, it works really well. So right, Raichu, that makes sense. So that person is using the excess of detail for gluttony as kind of, I think, probably a metaphor for the fact that it is gluttony. That can be definitely a valuable way of doing it, but you should do it with intention. So that's a so into hard and fast rules. Another hard and fast rule is probably don't give away the ending in the first sentence of the book. Or if you do, you had better make it really complicated. Um, um, so beta reading, if somebody says something is too long and they didn't really like that, if it's just one person, maybe it's not their taste. If if it's like 2, 3 people, is there anything in there that you could weed out? If it's everybody, you need to fix that. So with beta reading, unless the person doing your reading is an author themselves, like an experienced one, an editor, a publisher, or somebody who has like deep knowledge of how books function, um, if somebody from that sphere gives you very specific feedback, like, hey, the characterization in this scene doesn't work, and it gives you some really detailed feedback, you should listen to that. However, if it's just like, your friends are reading your book, if you give your book to 5 friends, you're going to get 5 different opinions about what they did or didn't like about a scene. And if multiple people are saying the same thing about a scene, they either really like or really don't like it, then you pay attention. If they're telling you how to fix it, they're probably wrong. But if they keep stumbling over the same thing, then that's something you should probably pay attention to. Um, so, kind of going back to the first act, the job of the first act explicitly is to set up your bowling pins and say, okay, here's my world, here's my character, here's my conflict, here's some other characters, like kind of you're setting up your bowling pins. Act 2 is you're hurling your bowling ball at them. Hadouken! Goodbye to all your pins. When it comes to describing your character's looks, I think that's dumb, honestly. Even if it's not in depth. So I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about, Heather, and that is something about on which that individual and I disagree about strenuously. You don't need to describe every single freckle that character has on their face, but a little bit. So, from that individual that you're talking about, Heather, I respect and love him to pieces. However, his writing is extremely Spartan, and I don't really like that. Having exceptionally Spartan writing is not entirely bad. Obviously it's very successful in places, but in a lot of genres it doesn't work. If you are writing a murder mystery, you need description because you absolutely need to show all of the you need to describe the clues, you need to describe the scene, it needs to be evocative, they need to feel it. If you just say, yeah, there's a body on the floor over there with some blood, it's not really going to evoke much. So thank you, Ellie. Thank you so much. In romance, the readers really want to know what the characters look like and erotica, because that's where the fun, the jiggity jiggity happens. Yes, the jiggity jiggity, judge me all you want. I'm just going to keep going. In fantasy, you need to describe the world because otherwise the reader has no idea what they're looking at. In sci-fi, you might tell them that it is an F900 battleship with proton thrusters. I have no idea what that's going to look like. Chances are I'm going to picture either the Enterprise or a TIE fighter because I've seen those. So exceptionally Spartan prose is it. I would say it's okay for literary fiction. Oh no, did it? Is everybody else hearing me? It looks like Cat just had a connection problem. Okay. So I'm going to have if there's a situation where thrusters erotica joke, taking the high road, Heather, but I hear you. So if you're going to be having a setting that isn't just what's outside my window, there needs to be description. You have to. Otherwise, people aren't going to see it. And, well, I might know what the inside of a medieval tavern looks like. Welcome back, Kat. Well, I might have a very strong idea of what a particular tunic looks like. My readers are not. It's going to be a bunch of people wearing, like, it's going to be a bunch of, like, paper dolls in a white room interacting with each other. There's going to be no color, no depth. So the balance between too much description and not enough, it's kind of a fine line, and sometimes it depends on genre, because literary fiction, you don't necessarily need that description unless it is something that is really specifically important to the, you're using it as a metaphor. The color of the curtains reflects the colors, the character's mood, and whatever. I don't know, lit fic, man. So that's a thing. However, if you aren't doing that, and you are just, for example, sorry, my husband's getting up. If you are just, for example, describing your main character, well, my main character, Cass, sure, she could be anybody, but I have a very specific image in my head of her, and it's important. Like the fact that Cass has black hair, blue eyes, and is built very broad and square. That's sufficient. Or I always go back to Neil Gaiman's description of somebody in American Gods saying he was the size and shape of a refrigerator. It was a side character, it didn't really matter, but that description stuck with me because it made perfect sense. I could see it in my head. I've seen people who look like that. You know, size and shape of a refrigerator, it makes sense. And he didn't need to go in-depth description of it because it didn't matter. But you had that image in your head, and boom, okay, I'm there. Right, a fabulous stick of asparagus. I love that. I don't know where it came from. I've never heard it before, but it makes me happy. I love it. So you can pack a lot of description into a very short place. Well, anagram, that is fantastic. I love it. Use it in something. I want to read it. Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it. So you don't need to just forsake all description, and I think anybody who tells you that is making a serious mistake. With all appropriate and legitimate respect and affection. And yes, there's the fact that readers are going to picture your characters and your setting and your world. However, they're going to picture your characters and setting and world. They are going to see something that isn't what you see. And most of the time, that's perfectly okay. They don't need to see exactly what you're seeing, and they don't need to picture your characters exactly as you see them, because part of the fun of the book is developing these images in your own head. That's, just, as has been said, I sit around staring at a piece of pulped wood, hallucinating vividly for hours. That's my entertainment. And the ability to make that hallucination mine is valuable. But knowing that but exactly right, you. If you have no description whatsoever, it's like dialogue floating through this blank white room in your head, and you don't really see things. So, I think I've kind of done this to death, but under description is, in fact, as bad as over description. It just uses fewer words. As a result of some of that advice that I was given a while back, I tend to have really Spartan prose, and I'm trying very hard to break myself of that because it doesn't work for what I write. It doesn't work. I can always go back in and add things later when I'm editing, and I do that, so that works, but it's awful, and it's such a bad habit for my genre. So, to go back into the Act 1, right? To sum up, you introduce your character, your setting, and your conflict. And you're going to describe these things enough that the reader is going to be able to see them, hear them, understand them. The introduction for the conflict should be what kind of grabs the reader and drags them further into the story. Because if they've spent that much time, if they've read your book for 15-ish thousand words, then they are committed, and you're kind of reward that commitment by saying, by the way, here's everything changing. Strap in, kids, things are going to get rough, and you're rewarding that time and that commitment. Whereas you've spent the rest of this setting up the before situation, the character's comfort zone, then you're just going to take that away. And taking that away is the impetus for the rest of the story. It's the reason the rest of the story happens. So the job of the first act is to do those things. It is to introduce your character, your world, your setting. And yeah, oh, you like that character? You're never going to guess what happens to them. Mustache twirling. And it's good. So it's also kind of the fun part of the book to write, because I know pretty much every writer on the planet has started about 500 million different stories and finished none of them, or very few of them. There is no mustache emote at all. So you have, most of us have written at least the beginning or even up to halfway of Act 1 1,000 times. So most of us know how Act 1 kind of sets up, and as a couple people said, it sort of writes itself in a way. Your first act is just going to kind of fall out of you a lot of the time. It's just going to... Act 2 is where it starts getting more difficult, but right, anagram, right? But it typically just kind of on the table. It just sort of all happens. Even pantsers who haven't planned their book, the first act is usually the part that just sort of falls out organically. It happens real quick. It's when you have all that momentum and all that excitement, and you're like, yeah, let's do the thing. And then, as I've talked about last week, you sometimes hit the wall of the second act. So you're going to end up with that difficulty. And Act 2 is definitely work. Act 1 is definitely fun. But in Act 1, in that fun, we need to make sure we hit those beats. The beat sheet. Hit the beats. Sorry. I'm not even... You know what? I'm not even going to apologize. I'm not sorry at all. But those beats usually show up organically. They just kind of happen. They just do. And it's not extremely difficult to make them happen like that. So Act 1 is I would say it's the easiest of the 3 acts to write. But it does create the underpinning for the rest of your novel. It's you setting up all of the pieces. So while it is the easiest to write, you definitely need to keep in mind that you setting up all these pieces, what pieces you're going to use where, what threads you're going to pull in the second act, and how you're going to take these pieces and collapse the building on the main character in the second half of the book. Because you're going to spend all of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2 building up a lovely little house, gingerbread and frosting and gumdrops, and then Act 2, the witch comes home, and you discover that it was not, in fact, gingerbread. It is, in fact, horrible. So yeah, exactly. You're putting up Chekhov's arsenal. I like that anagram. You're putting all the little things on the walls and decorating, and yes, I'm using you and you and you, and it's going to be delicious. And then, of course, in Act 2, you murder the characters with it, which is also a great deal of fun. So, do we have any further questions about Act 1? I know I've kind of babbled your ears off because my ADHD medication makes me excitable. Anybody have anything to ask or anything I missed? I'm grooving to the Jeopardy music in my head. Oh, I'm so sorry, Heather. So Carl, usually what I do before I even start writing is I know what's going to happen ish in the whole book. I outline the whole thing using the beat sheet. which I've talked about a number of times. I can always talk to you about that privately if you'd like to. But I have a rough idea of where the whole book is going. So in Act 1, I'm setting up the things that are going to come down in Act 2 and get rebuilt in Act 3. So I'm doing it intentionally. Now, you don't 100% have to know everything that's going to happen. You don't, because the joy of editing, you can always go back into Act 1 and add something that you need later, or subtract something you didn't use. So don't stress it too hard, because writing the first draft is only the first beginning steps of the process of publishing a book. It is not, in fact, the only one though. So you can definitely go back and fix things and add them. And so it's okay to not have a perfect, clear, precise, organized view of what your book is going to be like when you hit the ending, when you start. That's fine. If you have an idea, it makes it easier in editing later. But if you don't, the world won't end. I mean, there's a delete key. You're fine. Absolutely. Glad I was able to help clear that up. Anybody else have anything? Next week, we are going to be talking about Act 3. And yeah, Mel, that is absolutely the case. Sometimes when it just becomes apparent, you just sometimes uncover it while you're writing things. That can happen. And sometimes what you were planning to have happen and what actually happened don't match up. So you have to kind of pull out some duct tape and, fix that later. But, that's it. That's its own problem. That's future me's problem. um, Also, briefly, uh, that is a very useful thing to do, right? You definitely, I prefer to go back and add rather than subtract and move, but that's a personal preference. So to address the thing I brought up in the general chat, I am looking at starting a Patreon account, which will change absolutely nothing about this group. The group will stay as is. We'll still do our weekly meetings. I will still be here to critique and chit chat and bullshit with you guys. The Patreon is going to be providing access to editing services for a set number of words per month, and also one-on-one coaching time. I'm looking at between $20 and $30 for the two different tiers, and I'm considering so it's not going to be excessively expensive. I'm also hoping to eventually start working on doing some video content that will be a little more organized than this and kind of go along with my blog. It Carl, I think it does. I think Patreon accepts from anywhere. I don't know, but that's something I've really examined yet. But that is something that I'm kind of working on because it will give my company some support in between big projects. It'll give me an injection of funds to do marketing, and it will also give me a little bit back because I actually spend a lot of time researching this stuff and want to, and sometimes I do it instead of some other editing work on occasion. So my hope is to kind of take what I'm doing, and also when somebody hires me to work on their manuscript, that can be a lot of money. So for an average manuscript, I make $1,200 to $1,500 to edit a manuscript from stem to stern, and that's one pass. That is a lot, and I know it's a lot. But doing this, it would be a chapter or so, like 2,000 words ish every month. And so if you had the subscription long enough, we would have the opportunity for me to edit your entire book. And I believe it will be a discount on having me edit it at once, but the downside is it might take me a year or more to get through the whole thing. So that would be kind of the value added piece of this. I'm still going to be doing critiques for people here, so that's not changing. Nothing here is changing. I don't want to lock anybody out or try and monetize my channel here. Short stories are fine. My hope is just to kind of give another level of access that fairly rewards me for my time. I'm working on setting up the Patreon thing. I apparently had an account, but I don't now, and there's some technical crap, but I'm gonna be kind of unveiling that. Yeah, I'm fine with your sort of filth. I'm down with filth. Let's do it. Um, I think I may actually be kinkier than you are, Heather. So filth is great. Uh, but yeah, if any of you are interested in that, I'm trying to make it. Like I said, I'm trying to make the price pretty accessible. I don't want to make it super expensive, but I'd like to make it fair. I'm thinking the coaching would be like an hour, more or less, maybe half an hour depending on what people need. I haven't really given too much thought on it, but if you have any suggestions, thoughts, or requests, please let me know. And the homework this week is going to be looking at, again, some kind of media. I don't care if it's a movie, a book, a video game, and taking the first act and identifying the places where the creator, author, writer, again, depending on the media, does that. They introduce the character here. They give you all the setting info you need, or at least the start of it here, and then here's where the conflict starts. So identifying the catalyst and the before time. So if you can do that for me this week, again, you don't need to write a huge essay, just kind of do the thing. Um, you can even take a book or something you've written and identify that too. You can do it with your own work. I don't care. Um, it is never too late to do the homework. So last week, since a couple of you weren't here, the homework was to identify the midpoint of a story and identify act 2 of a story. Again, doesn't matter what story. Just be thinking about it when you're consuming media. Even if you don't write anything, just let it process, let it percolate in the back of your little brains and turn into delicious coffee. I don't know. Uh, I'm a little tired. So that's the homework for this week. Uh, I'm going to be doing Act 3 next week. So we're going to be digging into what needs to happen at the climax of the story, what needs to occur there. So that's really where I think I'm going to go. And as I said at the beginning of this, being in order is for losers. So that's why we did 2, 1, 3. So whatever. I think after that, I might do a deep dive on what you need to do in your first chapter and how to hook people. That's not entirely different from your first act, but the first chapter and that beginning hook are really important, and I know a lot of authors agonize over it, so I think it's worth having a talk about. But if you guys have anything specific you want me to talk about and I haven't done that yet, let me know. I'm happy to talk your ear off about anything. It is a little after 7, so anybody else have anything quick while we are wrapping up? You're very welcome, Heather. Good luck with the cheese. Oh no. You're very welcome. I'm glad you guys keep coming. I'm glad you guys enjoy it. I really enjoy having you guys here. It's nice to talk to you guys, and it feels good because this is what I love doing. So getting to babble on about it for an hour is great.